Thank you all for the support, I very much appreciate it. Here we have 3 scary stories involving abandoned houses. What terror awakes? Have any of you been in abandoned buildings to explore? Say in the comment section below.
The crew of the ghost hunting show, Paranormal Pursuit, had seen it all. They had investigated countless haunted locations across the country, conjured up fake scares, and played up their dramatic antics for the camera. They were the masters of illusion and trickery, and their audience loved them for it. But when they arrived at the old, abandoned house in the middle of nowhere, they knew something was different. The house was like no other they had ever seen before. It was a looming, foreboding presence that seemed to draw them in with its twisted, gnarled trees and creaky shutters. As they set up their equipment and prepared to begin filming, they could feel the weight of the house bearing down on them. It was as if the very air around them was thick with some unnameable dread. The night began uneventfully enough, with the team making their usual dramatic entrances and introductions. But as they began to explore the house, they noticed strange occurrences that they couldn't explain away. Doors slammed shut on their own, objects moved inexplicably, and they heard whispers and moans coming from empty rooms. But, as usual, they chalked it up to their own props and special effects. As they continued their investigation, they began to find clues to a darker history. They found remnants of bloodstains on the floorboards and old newspaper clippings about a murder-suicide that had taken place years prior. They also uncovered old journals and diaries that spoke of strange, otherworldly happenings in the house. The team began to feel a palpable sense of fear and unease as the night wore on. Shadows flickered on the walls, and they swear they heard footsteps stalking them wherever they went. The air was thick with the smell of decay and the sound of whispers. And then, in the middle of filming, they heard it. A blood-curdling scream that sent shivers down their spines. They rushed to the source of the sound, only to find one of their team members lying on the ground, badly injured and bleeding. They tried to revive him, but he was beyond help. His last words were a plea for them to leave the house and never come back. The team was shaken and afraid, but they refused to give up their investigation. As they reviewed the footage later, they were horrified to discover that they had not staged anything. Something truly sinister had taken place in that house. They could see the dark, shadowy figures lurking in the corners, the spectral forms that flitted across the screen. But it was too late. The damage had been done. The team's show was abruptly cancelled, and they were forced to face the consequences of their actions. They had been too eager to chase the thrill of the supernatural, too blind to the dangers that lurked in the darkness. The team tried to move on with their lives, but the secrets of the past haunted them long after the show went off the air. They began to experience strange, unexplainable occurrences in their daily lives, and some even reported seeing the ghostly apparitions from the house following them around. They knew then that they had unwittingly unleashed something terrible into the world, something that they could never hope to contain or control. The curse of the ghost hunter's life was upon them, and they knew that they would never truly be free of it.
It was a house like any other in the neighborhood, with a perfectly manicured lawn and white picket fence. But there was something different about this house that none of the other homes on the street possessed. A sense of unease hung in the air around it, and every time someone passed by, they couldn't help but shiver. The locals avoided it like the plague, whispering about the horrors that lurked inside. The stories were passed down from generation to generation, each one more terrifying than the last. Rumor had it that a family of 5 had been brutally murdered inside, and their bodies were never found. The killer had never been caught, and the house had been abandoned ever since. Jacob had never been one to shy away from a good scare, and the house on that street had always piqued his interest. So, when he found himself walking past it one evening, he decided to take a peek inside. The windows were boarded shut, but through the cracks, he could just about make out the furniture within. He felt a sudden chill on the back of his neck, and a shadow seemed to move behind the curtains. It was then that he heard the whispers, faint but unmistakable. He tried to brush them off, but the sense of unease only grew stronger. The door creaked as he pushed it open, and a musty smell hit his nostrils. He crept through the house, his footsteps echoing through the empty rooms. The floorboards groaned with every step, and the sound seemed to reverberate through the walls. He was sure that he could hear something moving in the darkness, something that was watching him. As he walked through the hallway, a sudden gust of wind slammed the door behind him shut. He spun around, his heart pounding in his chest. He was trapped, with no way out. And that's when he heard the screams, the sound of agony and terror that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He tried to run, but his feet were rooted to the spot. The whispers grew louder, and the shadows more intense. It was then that he saw the apparitions, the ghosts of the murdered family that had been trapped inside the house. They were screaming in pain and begging for help. Jacob tried to run, but he couldn't escape. The house had claimed another victim, and he would never be seen again. The house would remain empty, a dark reminder of what happens when curiosity strikes.
I hope you enjoy the content I upload. If you like what I'm doing, why not think about clicking on the subscribe button to keep up to date on my uploads. Thank you all for the great support. As the sun set over the town, casting long shadows across the abandoned house on Oakley Street, the first signs of the malevolent force that resided within its walls began to stir. The wind howled through the overgrown gardens, rustling the leaves of the trees that surrounded the property and sending a chill down the spine of anyone who dared to venture too close. For years, the house had stood empty, a relic of a bygone era that had long since been forgotten. Its once grand stone walls were now weathered and worn, its gardens overgrown and unkempt. The townspeople whispered about the dark history that loomed over the property, of the unspeakable horrors that had taken place within its walls. But despite its ominous reputation, the house had always been a source of fascination for the townspeople. Its dilapidated state and mysterious past had given rise to countless rumors and legends, each more fantastical than the last. Some said that the former residents of the house had dabbled in the dark arts, invoking ancient curses that still lingered within its walls. Others claimed that the house was haunted by the ghosts of those who had died within its walls, their restless spirits unable to find peace. And so it was that when the news broke that the owners of the property had finally decided to demolish the old house and put up a new development in its place, the townspeople were torn. On the one hand, they were glad to see the house finally being given a new lease on life. On the other hand, they couldn't help but feel a sense of foreboding, a feeling that something dark and sinister lay hidden within the walls of the decaying mansion. The heartless developers arrived on site with bulldozers and cranes, ready to reduce the once proud house to a pile of rubble. They didn't care about the history that lay within the walls of the structure, nor did they care about the secrets that were buried deep in its foundation. All they saw was an opportunity to make a quick profit, to turn the abandoned property into a lucrative new development that would bring in millions. But as they began to tear down the house, strange things began to happen. The construction crew reported feeling as if they were being watched by unseen eyes, and their tools went missing, only to reappear in strange places days later. In the middle of the night, the sound of slamming doors and creaking floorboards could be heard coming from the empty house, as if the ghosts of the past were protesting the destruction of their home. At first, the developers brushed off the strange occurrences as mere superstition, the overactive imaginations of a group of workers who were already nervous about tearing down a house with such a dark history. But as the days passed, and the activity within the house grew more and more intense, even the most skeptical among them began to feel a sense of unease. The malevolent force that resided within the walls of the house was growing stronger, its power fueled by the destruction that was taking place all around it. The severed limbs of long-dead animals were found neatly arranged on the dusty floorboards, and strange, unidentifiable fluids oozed from the crevices in the walls. The developers pressed on, determined to complete their demolition without delay. But as the house began to crumble under their efforts, they realized with horror that something evil lurked within its walls. The very air within the house seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy, as if the malevolent force that resided within was preparing to strike. One of the workers, a burly man named Frank, was the first to fall victim to the dark entity that had taken up residence within the house. He had been working in the heart of the house, trying to remove a particularly stubborn section of wall, when he felt a sudden, intense pressure on his chest. The air around him grew thick and suffocating, and he struggled to draw breath. His vision blurred, and he felt himself slipping away. Just as he thought he would lose consciousness, the pressure lifted, and he stumbled backward, gasping for air. His fellow workers rushed to his side, concerned looks etched on their faces. "Are you all right, Frank?" one of them asked. Frank nodded weakly, but his face was pale, and he was shaking. "I don't know what happened," he said hoarsely. "It was like something was sitting on my chest, crushing the life out of me." The other workers exchanged uneasy glances, and one of them muttered something about the house being cursed. Despite their growing unease, the workers pressed on with the demolition, determined to complete the job and move on to their next assignment. But as the days wore on, strange things continued to happen. Tools went missing, only to reappear in unlikely places days later. Cold spots could be felt in certain rooms, and strange, unexplained noises echoed through the halls. One evening, after a particularly grueling day, the workers gathered around a campfire they had built in the overgrown garden. They cracked open beers and swapped stories, trying to shake off the unease that had settled over them like a thick fog. It was then that one of the workers, a wiry man named Tom, spoke up. "Have any of you seen her?" he asked, his voice low and conspiratorial. "Seen who?" one of the others asked. "The girl," Tom said. "The one who watches us from the window." The other workers exchanged puzzled glances, and one of them snorted. "You've been working too hard, Tom," he said. "There's no one in that house except for us." But Tom shook his head, his eyes wide with conviction. "No, I'm serious," he said. "I've seen her a couple of times now. She's always standing in the same window, just watching us work." The other workers fell silent, and a chill settled over the group. "Tom, there's no one in that house," one of them said. "It's been abandoned for years." But Tom was adamant. "I know what I saw," he said. "And she's not alone, either. I've seen shadows moving in the other rooms, too." The other workers exchanged uneasy glances, and the conversation died down. Despite their skepticism, they couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them from within the walls of the old house. As the days passed, the workers became more and more unsettled. One by one, they began to fall ill with mysterious, debilitating diseases. Frank, the first to experience the strange pressure on his chest, was hospitalized with a sudden, inexplicable bout of pneumonia. Another worker, a young man named Jack, developed a strange rash that covered his entire body and defied all attempts at treatment. Even the foreman, a gruff, no-nonsense man named Bill, began to show signs of illness. He grew gaunt and pale, and his once booming voice was reduced to a hoarse whisper. Despite their growing fears, the workers continued to press on with the demolition. They knew that their livelihoods were at stake, and they couldn't afford to walk away from the job. But as the days wore on, it became increasingly clear that something was fighting back against their efforts. In the following days, the workers became increasingly uneasy as they noticed more strange occurrences. Their tools would go missing and reappear in odd places, as if someone or something was playing tricks on them. They heard unexplained footsteps and whispers, and saw shadows moving in the corners of their eyes. The air was thick with a palpable sense of unease, as if the house itself was alive and watching them. Despite the growing fear among the workers, the developers remained determined to complete their task. But as the demolition progressed, it became clear that there was more to the house than met the eye. Beneath the layers of grime and dust, they found evidence of unspeakable acts that had taken place within its walls. The remains of small animals were discovered, their limbs arranged in strange patterns on the dusty floorboards. Unidentifiable fluids oozed from the cracks in the walls, and the air was heavy with the stench of decay. It was as if the house itself was a living, breathing entity that had been steeped in darkness for centuries. As the workers continued their efforts to tear down the house, they began to fall ill with mysterious ailments. Some complained of nausea and headaches, while others experienced strange rashes and respiratory problems. Frank's condition worsened, and he was hospitalized with a high fever and respiratory distress. The doctors were baffled by his illness, unable to determine its cause. They tried various treatments, but nothing seemed to alleviate his symptoms. Frank's wife sat by his bedside day and night, praying for his recovery. But despite her efforts, Frank's condition continued to deteriorate. Meanwhile, the developers became increasingly agitated as their project ground to a halt. They had invested a great deal of time and money into the demolition, and the delays were costing them dearly. They demanded that the workers push through their fear and continue with the job, but the men were too spooked to comply. One evening, as the sun began to set, a group of the workers gathered outside the house to discuss their next move. They were reluctant to enter the house after dark, but knew that they had to do something to appease the developers. They decided to draw straws to see who would enter the house and retrieve the missing tools. The unlucky man was a young worker named Tom, who drew the shortest straw. He took a deep breath and stepped inside the darkened foyer, his heart pounding in his chest. The air was thick with the smell of decay, and the only sound was his own labored breathing. Tom made his way through the empty rooms, his flashlight casting long, eerie shadows on the walls. He felt as if he was being watched by unseen eyes, and his nerves were stretched to the breaking point. As he approached the room where the tools had been stored, he heard a low, guttural growl emanating from the shadows. He froze, his heart pounding in his chest. The growling grew louder, and he could hear something moving in the darkness. He shone his flashlight in the direction of the sound, and his blood ran cold at what he saw. A pair of glowing eyes stared back at him from the shadows, their eerie green light casting an otherworldly glow on the decaying walls. Tom stood frozen in fear as the creature emerged from the darkness, its massive frame towering over him. It was unlike anything he had ever seen before. Its skin was a sickly green color, and its body was covered in patches of matted fur. Its eyes glowed with an otherworldly light, and its teeth were razor sharp. It let out a low growl, baring its teeth in a feral snarl. Its body moved with a primal agility, and its jaws snapped shut inches away from Tom's face. Tom fell back onto the ground, hitting his head on a rock, and the creature let out a triumphant howl. Blood seeped from the wound on Tom's head, and he struggled to get back up, his vision blurred and his thoughts muddled. The creature circled around him, its growls growing louder with each passing second. Tom realized that he was in mortal danger, and he desperately searched for a way to defend himself. He reached for a nearby rock, hoping to use it as a weapon, but the creature was too fast. It lunged at him again, its claws digging into his flesh. Tom screamed in agony as the creature tore into his skin, ripping away flesh and muscle with each swipe of its claws. He could feel his life force ebbing away, his blood soaking into the ground beneath him. The creature was relentless, and it showed no signs of stopping. Just when Tom thought that he was doomed, he heard a sudden noise from behind the creature. The creature turned its head, distracted for a moment, and that was all the time Tom needed. He scrambled to his feet and bolted for the door, not daring to look back. He burst through the door, stumbling out into the sunlight. He collapsed onto the ground, gasping for air, his body slick with blood. He heard the creature's snarls from inside the house, and he knew that he had narrowly escaped with his life. Tom lay there for what felt like an eternity, his mind a blur of pain and fear. Eventually, he managed to pull himself to his feet, using the wall of the house to support himself. He looked down at his wounds, and he saw that they were deep and jagged. Blood dripped from them, staining his clothes and the ground beneath him. He stumbled back to the construction site, desperate to get help. The other workers were shocked at the sight of him, and they immediately called for an ambulance. Tom was rushed to the hospital, where he underwent emergency surgery. He had suffered severe injuries, and he was lucky to be alive. After Tom's attack, the workers refused to return to the house on Oakley Street. They were all too terrified of what lurked within its walls, and they feared for their lives. The developers were forced to abandon their plans for the new development, and the house remained standing, a dark reminder of the horrors that lay within. As the days passed, rumors began to circulate about the creature that had attacked Tom. Some said that it was a demon, summoned from the depths of hell by the ancient curses that had been placed upon the house. Others whispered that it was a vengeful ghost, seeking retribution for the desecration of its home. Despite the rumors, no one knew for certain what had attacked Tom. But one thing was clear. The house on Oakley Street was cursed, and no one who entered its walls would ever be the same again.